Welcome, everyone. My name is Rahsaan Hall. I am the director of the Racial Justice Program for the ACLU of Massachusetts. And so on behalf of the ACLU and the New England Area Conference of the NAACP, as well as the Black and Latino Legislative Caucus, we want to thank you for coming to this legislative briefing. This is a very important conversation, particularly given all that is going on in our country right now, concerns around policing and racism more generally. And there are moves within the Massachusetts legislature, as well as the governor, trying to address the concerns that people have been raising about the institution of policing in light of some of the incidents, recent incidents that people have borne witness to of police killing of unarmed Black men. So we are privileged today to have a collection of national experts, local advocates, and legislators to discuss one of the more significant reforms that's being talked about in Massachusetts, which is the Peace Officers Standard and Training System, otherwise known as POST. We are intentional about wanting to ensure that legislators here have the opportunity to learn about what the POST system is, what a strong POST system is, and how it can work here in Massachusetts, particularly in light of information that's come out that Governor Baker will be introducing a POST bill. For today's agenda, we will have some opening remarks from Representative Russell Holmes on behalf of the Mass Black and Latino Legislative Caucus, and also some conversation about the work leading up to this point, and Representative David Vieira. I'll then introduce our panelists, and we will, after the panelists are asked some questions, we'll have Q&A. Primarily, again, we want to prioritize questions from legislators and legislator staffers, but then open it up to questions from the press and the general public who are watching via live stream on Facebook. Just logistically speaking, to ask a question for anyone who is in the webinar, and that would be primarily legislative staffers and those from the press, we ask that you use the raise hand function. That will ensure that we can call on you based on the order in which you raised your hand. For the members of the public who are watching on Facebook Live, please ask any question in the chat function. But again, for members of the legislature or their staffers and press who are on the webinar, please use the raise hand function so that we can call on you in the order that you're called. If anyone who is in the webinar, legislators, staffers, or press that have any technical difficulties, let us know using the chat function. But again, if members of legislature, staff, or press in the webinar have questions, use the raise hand function, and members of the public can ask questions through Facebook Live on the chat function. So I'm pleased to introduce at this point Representative Russell Holmes, who can come and address or make some opening remarks on behalf of the Black and Latino Caucus, and also address some of the work that has happened up until this point. Representative Holmes.
Thank you, Rahsaan. I just want to spend just my minute to just simply say thank you, the ACLU, the NAACP, all of the panelists. It is excellent to see Professor Goldman and Jamarhl and you and Rep. Vieira. We began this as just an idea around pushing the state towards a commission to go study what we should do around POST. And it was Rep. Vieira's experience of training before that allowed us to have this as a bipartisan bill that made sense. And of course, Professor Goldman and Jamarhl really working this issue so hard from the beginning. And I'm just so thankful for us to come back full circle to when we may be able to actually put this together. I would like to just say that we're past the commission. So some folks were curious about whether or not what's being proposed by the governor today or tomorrow will be a commission to study whether or not we should do a commission. The agreement now has been through an awful lot of hard work with the caucus and the governor with many meetings to say that we're going to now go and set up an actual POST system. And so they've been meeting quite a bit. That is the administration, for the most part, when they thought that it was going to be just something that could be done administratively. We have now a broad support, as Rahsaan mentioned, about just the number of people who are now in agreement. The caucus has met with the speaker, and he has asked that Claire Cronin, our chair of judiciary, do something bold and broad that will include more than just posts. And so I look forward to hearing comments even beyond just posts. I know we've set aside some time on use of force, whether or not we should do a structural racism commission, certainly around civil service, which are the four things that the elected of color across the Commonwealth, when we came together with a plan on what we needed to do when we're listening to Black people, what we need to do federal, state, and city. And so we've gotten broad agreement from both the Senate President and the Speaker that they will look at all of those things that were on the state level and that were proposed by the elected of color across the Commonwealth. And so we're hoping to hear, of course, bring plenty of information today around posts, but also I very much like hearing from the community and very much would like to hear even things broader as we get beyond just the initial bill. Thank you for having me today.
Thank you, Representative Holmes, and thank you for all your work up to this point and being committed to really trying to see this through. I'd now like to turn it over to Representative David Vieira to address some of the effort that has happened up to this point. And in particular, Rep. Holmes mentioned that this is a bipartisan effort, and I think that's important, but it's also important to talk about the law enforcement engagement that you've been undertaking as well. Rep. Vieira.
Thanks, Rahsaan. It's good to be back from the early days when we were with Jamarhl and everyone down at Roxbury Community College doing the forum. Professor Goldman came up, visited, to last year testifying on the bill and having Representative Holmes come together, working together to make this, as you said, a bipartisan bill. As many as you know, I was a deputy sheriff for a number of years in Massachusetts, and when I got elected to the legislature in 2011, post was something that I began talking about, began filing the commission status bills in 2013. And then in 2015, met Representative Holmes, had a conversation about this, a priority that he had and the Black and Latino Legislative Caucus had, and said, well, let's do this together. Why? It doesn't have to be like two different things. Let's all get together. And so, Russ, thank you so much for the hard work that you've done and the caucus has done to continue to push this forward, regardless of what has happened in the last few weeks. This is something that the investment of the ACLU, the community, law enforcement, and the legislators has been ongoing. Of course, many times it takes a crisis or a situation to really put the spotlight on a particular piece of legislation. And that is where we are today. We're at the point where, as Representative Holmes said, we're not going to look at how to create post. We are going to create post. So over the last number of months, the administration had began working groups to look at the legislation and how this would work. The Black and Latino Caucus has reached out to the police unions, has worked with them to create a relationship. The meeting I was at yesterday, the relationship that was building is something that I never thought I'd see when we started this. And are there agreements? Yes. Are there disagreements? Yes. But we have to have a relationship going forward in order to make this work, not only to make the legislation work, but more importantly, to make the needed reform in the community and in policing work. And I'm very happy, very confident that we're headed in that direction. And so one of the things that I'm hopeful for today is to hear more questions and get input from the community, from colleagues in the legislature, so that as we embark on what might be a new topic to some, we can all have a base level of understanding and lean on the hard work that's been done and the expertise of folks like Professor Goldman, who has a national picture in this post-type system. So again, thanks for having me. Thanks for being together as a team, and we look forward to bringing this over the finish line in the next couple months.
Thank you so much, Representative Vieira. So now I'd like to turn and introduce the panelists that we have. We are fortunate to have a collection of both national experts as well as local advocates who have been pushing for this type of reform. And you know, one of the preeminent scholars and experts on the area is Professor Roger Goldman, who is the nation's foremost expert on police licensing and license revocation laws. For more than 2 decades, he's been helping states write and adopt laws that provide for removing the license or certificate of an officer who engages in serious misconduct such as sexual assault and brutality. Professor Goldman's ultimate goal is to help create a federally mandated national data bank of decertified police officers to prevent them from moving and being employed in a different state. Professor Roger Goldman. Next, we have Dan Zivkovich. He has 38 years of policing experience that includes oversight of training and training standards and administrative oversight of agencies and systems. He previously served as a Wyoming State Trooper and eventually became the director of the Wyoming Law Enforcement Academy, the state's centralized and only police training facility, and later became the chief of the Jackson, Wyoming Police Department. In 2009, Dan was named the executive director of the Massachusetts Municipal Police Training Commission until he retired last year. He is also a lifetime member of the International Association of Directors of Law Enforcement Standards and Training, or IADLIS, serving 2 terms as its president. He also continues to be on the executive board of IADLIS. Jamarhl Crawford is a lifetime Boston resident, community activist, political candidate, and police accountability specialist. Jamarhl is a founder of organizations and movements such as Blackstonian, an online news publication focusing on the concerns of Black Boston, Occupy the Hood, mass police reform, de-certify police, and several others. A former member of the New Black Panther Party and political consultants for both Mayor Menino and Walsh administrations, Jamarhl has used his life experience, advocacy, and community organizing skills to push for greater police reform in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. He's also a member of the Boston Police Department's Social Justice Task Force. Sophia Hall, from Lawyers for Civil Rights, is an experienced litigator who handles a broad range of civil rights matters. She actively represents people of color and immigrants, women, to protect their rights in the workplace and in the community. She successfully resolved a precedent-setting racial profiling matter, creating a blueprint for police departments across the country to implement comprehensive implicit bias and search and seizure training. She also filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against the Boston Police Department on behalf of the family of Terrence Coleman, a Black man living with schizophrenia that was shot and killed by police when seeking medical assistance. And finally, Lisa Thurau. In 2004, Lisa initiated a training with 180 officers in the Massachusetts Bay Transit Authority, or the MBTA, transit police to improve police-youth interactions, to increase officers' skills in working with youth, and to support officers' development of innovative approaches to policing large groups of teen and public transit areas. The impacts of her advocacy and training efforts leading significant reductions in juvenile arrests by MBTA, Everett, and Cambridge police departments. In 2009, Lisa founded Strategies for Youth, Inc., a nonprofit advocacy and training organization dedicated to improving police and youth interactions. Strategies for Youth is a nationally known organization working in 38 counties in 20 states. Strategies for Youth is often consulted by the U.S. Department of Justice and U.S. Department of Education on policing matters, policy development, and recommendations for best practices. Prior to forming Strategies for Youth from 1999 to 2008, Lisa served as policy specialist and then as managing directors for the Juvenile Justice Center of Suffolk Law. So again, as I said, we are very fortunate to have a great collection of individuals on this panel today who can provide a lot of insight and expertise as to what is before us with POST, particularly again in light of all that is happening in our country, the cries and demands of the public for everything from police reform to police abolition. And so we are going to get into this conversation specifically talking about what a peace officer standards and training system is. And so Professor Goldman, I'll turn to you first and ask you to describe what a POST system is and how it has evolved since the first one in New Mexico.
Thanks, Rahsaan. Many of you may recall the 1968 Kerner Commission report set up by President Johnson. Its most famous conclusion was that this quote, "Our nation is moving towards two societies, one Black, one white, separate and unequal." What you may not know is that part of that report recommended that each state establish statewide training standards, ultimately becoming posts. And that's when the many states did set up those training standards. That's how it began. For most states, they didn't really have revocation. It was needing minimum standards for training for police through police academies. And today, all states but Hawaii do have, I wouldn't call them posts, but commissions or boards that do require statewide training. Interestingly enough, Hawaii, which is one of the states that today doesn't have a post at all, it's up to each state, each island's police department. Hawaii actually passed a law a couple years ago, but it's never been implemented. So Hawaii still has no statewide training standards. Many states, I'd say most states, do have, in addition though to mandated training for officers, also qualifications, minimum qualifications. A couple of states actually require some college. Other states would say things like, if you've had a bad conduct discharge from the military, you can't get in. Felony convictions. So before you can be certified to even go to the academy, you have to pass through those minimum qualifications. But what we're going to be focusing mostly on today is that a post needs to have a decertification system, a way to revoke the license of officers who seriously misbehave. All states now, with the exception of Massachusetts, Hawaii, New Jersey, Rhode Island, and California, do have this ability to decertify. And of course, as you know, the governor of Massachusetts now said we need to do that. Just yesterday, the Attorney General of California said we need to have a decertification system. The New Jersey Attorney General recently said the same thing. And so, you know, as we all keep saying, the timing is everything. So I think ultimately, every state will have this ability to have minimum training, continuing education as an officer, and decertification. Some of you may have seen that at the federal level, Senator Tim Scott has now recommended decertification as well. So the recent, just recently, a lot is coming together after my many years working in this area. So in terms of what a good post system and how it's evolved over the days, especially with respect to decertification, is to think of it as you do virtually every other profession and occupation that's regulated in the state. Cosmetologists, lawyers, doctors, you name it. This is not a new concept. And I can't think of any other profession or occupation in the state that doesn't have a system for removing a licensee for serious misconduct. So this is not rocket science. In fact, it's astounding to me that here we are at this time of, in where we are in 2020, that not every state has there. But I think ultimately we'll get there. And I'm just so pleased to see that Massachusetts as well has on that path now. In terms of what is a good post system with respect to decertification, there are three characteristics that I would emphasize. Number one, a comprehensive definition of what constitutes decertifiable conduct. About a third of the states that decertify are woefully inadequate. They require a criminal conviction, felony, and certain misdemeanors. But what other occupation can you think of that requires a conviction to lose your license? A barber who, keeps cutting your head? No, it doesn't have to be convicted. So you have to have a system that would have the ability to decertify for the commission of misconduct, not the conviction of misconduct. And of course, that's important because if you just fire someone, there's a lot of attention, so what about just firing the person? Leave it up to each chief. Well, in some states, I don't know about your state, but those officers who've now been certified, that means they've been through their training, they can be picked up at another department where that misconduct can be repeated. I just read about a New Jersey officer who'd been fired from 9 different departments, and New Jersey doesn't have decertification. So that's number one. you have to have a broad definition of what can constitute a decertifiable conduct. Number two, you must include all law enforcement officers. Any officer who has the ability to, use deadly force, search and seize, go into your home with a warrant, must be covered. So that would mean deputy sheriff, state patrol, state police, at a minimum. Many states are now decertifying corrections officers, and those states don't use the word post. They're typically called Criminal Justice Standards and Training Commission. So Florida decertifies probation officers, parole officers. Oregon decertifies private security guards. So the breadth of who's covered is something to think about. You might need another commission, maybe post is not to do it. But let me just tell you, Florida, which is one of the most active states in terms of decertification, in 2015, the last survey, 3 times the number of corrections officers decertified compared to law enforcement officers. So that's just something to keep in mind. Number 3, you have to have a mechanism to ensure that local agencies are reporting to the post. What that mechanism should be the stick, that is criminal prosecution. I don't think that's very effective. Think about, I don't know if Massachusetts does this, but maybe there's training funds that could be withheld if chiefs don't, or some similar thing like that, to encourage, because you see particularly small departments that don't have a lot of money, they may be tempted to keep someone and not report because they really can't afford anybody other than officers who should be decertified. So those are the 3 things I'd emphasize: breadth of decertifiable conduct, a broad definition of who can be decertified, and some mechanism for ensuring compliance. I think I'll stop there, Rahsaan.
Okay, thank you. That was very informative, and thank you for the historical look back on the evolution of it. Dan Zivkovich, you have served in law enforcement, both as a state trooper and as a chief of a police department, and then gone on to oversee training establishment. So, why would police departments want a post system? And then coming from Wyoming, what is it like to be the head of a law enforcement organization in a state that has a post system?
Hi, Rahsaan. I think before I get to the direct answer to that, I think it helps to have some context in the foundation. To build on what Professor Goldman was saying, a strong post system has 3 main goals. The first is to assure or help assure that only qualified candidates come into the profession by setting some minimum hiring standards. The second goal is to make sure those officers then receive the best training possible to be successful in their profession and in their communities. And I'm not just talking about basic training, and I'm not just talking about continuing education training. I'm talking about training for every assignment that they may have, and that it's not just hours, it's also topics. And in light of what's happening nationwide now and the concerns nationwide, for example, every officer should be taught how to be a leader every shift, every day, in every situation, regardless of rank. And supervisors need to learn and be taught how to supervise. So in short, the post is equivalent to being guardians of professionalism and to be aiders of successful policing in the community. And consequently, there's only one group that needs to be concerned about a strong post-agency organization system as described by Professor Goldman, and that's those that don't belong in the profession. Chiefs don't need to be concerned. Sheriffs, colonels, officers should not look at posts as a hindrance or an obstacle. They should look at it as the community would, as an asset and an advocate for the profession. So that said, my interactions with posts in a strong post state were in 3 capacities. One, as you said, I was actually in charge of hiring and training for state police organization. I was an academy director, and I was also a chief of police. And in each of those capacities, not only did I meet the minimum post standards, because that's what post does, it sets minimum standards, I exceeded them because post doesn't hamper your ability to go above and beyond. And the reason why I exceeded them is because of the unique officers and characteristics we needed in our officers and some of our unique training that went along with our unique mission. So I layered additional steps and additional criteria on top of the post minimums for hiring. I layered additional training on to make sure that our troopers and our officers got specific training for the specific mission we gave them. So post does not change your ability to have an identity. It doesn't give you an identity or take away your identity. And it doesn't hamper your ability to hire the very best people. It doesn't control your hiring process. It doesn't control your training. It just sets minimum standards. And more importantly, it does not get involved in internal performance and disciplinary issues. I had to fire troopers, and some of those troopers were never decertified because they weren't fired for abuses of power. They were fired for not doing their job, and that's not a post issue. So, Rahsaan, after all of that, the short answer to your question is, what impact did it have on me as a training and standards administrator and a chief to be within a strong post system? The short answer is I had to fill out a few forms that said to attest to the fact that I had complied with minimum hiring and training and retention standards.
Thank you. That's helpful. I want to turn to you now, Jamarhl, and talk about the current political climate, culturally, politically, the advocacy that is happening. Again, people are calling for everything from reforms and body-worn cameras and civilian review boards to total absolute abolition of policing, defunding the police. And so there's a tension that exists there, and especially within the communities that are most over-policed, and Black communities in particular. Where is post the solution?
Yes, thank you for having me, and I'm glad to be here with everybody, and thank you for the previous comments. You know, I love hearing Professor Goldman speak, also as well as Zivkovich, you know, because what we find out is that when you're dealing with professional people, these things are not really an issue. So is post the answer? No, I don't think that there's one, you know, silver bullet or pill for police reform as a total. It needs to encompass a bunch of stuff. The climate now is, of course, I guess this is what people would call the come to Jesus moment. So where many of us who have been, you know, out shouting in the desert for years and years, right? And it has fallen on deaf ears, or there's been a reluctance and even a pushback for it. I think now, because of the time, there is a tidal wave that we have to be smart to ride in, right? So I don't know that I care how it gets done or whatever, but, you know, it is really good to see this energy, and hopefully now it finally gets done. But this is not the only thing that can be done. So behind some of the stuff here in Massachusetts, behind a post thing, what I noticed that is an impediment to this is that people just generally don't believe that we have a big problem. We're not like, you know, pick one, right? And it's really unfair. The data doesn't match it out. It's unfair. And by and large, as an activist, I know that one of the problems that we had suffered with was only focusing on cases of police brutality and the killing of civilians. And I separate those two, because police brutality is anything you can walk away from and tell the story. Killing of civilians is obviously final, the most extreme form of police brutality, right? But we find that most of the stuff, if we're talking about decertification and post, we find that most officers, they get jammed up with domestic violence, sexual misconduct, drunk driving, alcohol abuse, drug abuse, physical assault, bar brawls, all sorts of stuff, scandals, lies and perjury, racist incidents, wage fraud, and all this. So I believe, you know, Massachusetts loves a study, right? And a commission. So part of this, to inform this, is why we need this, and it's happening now. But now I really would like to see a study at all levels of just how many officers in the state of Massachusetts have come in contact with law enforcement. They've either been arrested, charged, or convicted of, you name the crime. And I've seen them, and the list is, the list has a wide variety. So those are the types of things that I would like to see, along with a statewide commission on policing, much like what Senator Patricia Jalen did years ago with a statewide commission on the DOC. I would like to see a continual statewide commission on policing, just to continually examine it. I would like to see civilian review boards, across the board, but true civilian review boards that, once again, don't just have a purview of police brutality and the killing of civilians. The civilian review board will be able to chime in on everything from training and budget to you name it. The civilians, the citizens, the police are public servants. We're the public, right? So I want to get back to more of that mentality. I'm very happy now that the time, even because of this tragedy, but the ball is now moving forward. God bless everybody in the State House who has tried to move this thing forward. If Governor Baker and others are now willing to move, I am just eager to see this ball get past the touchdown line, and then for us to figure out all the other things that we need to continue on, including supporting our DA in independent investigations of officers. Once again, not just limited to police brutality and killing of civilians, but there needs to be a whole different independent investigation system for officers, whatever they are engaged in. And decertification can get rid of them. Beforehand, we'd like to catch them, look at mental health and other stress factors and so on and so forth. Because as an activist, I've been called a cop hater. Not true. In fact, what serves me and my community is that we have the best police force that we can. I want everybody at their best. I want people healthy and operating at their best capacity for the community that we all live in.
Thank you, Jamarhl. I want to turn now to Sophia Hall. Could you talk about, Jamarhl had mentioned, the comparisons that get made, right? Boston is not, you name it, New York, Atlanta, Minneapolis. But we do have issues, and there are incidents, not just Boston, but throughout the Commonwealth. So could you talk about some of the cases that you at Lawyers for Civil Rights, or even some of the intakes that underscore the need to bring about this type of system, a post system?
Yeah, thank you for that, Rahsaan, and thank you for inviting me to this conversation. Lawyers for Civil Rights has been embedded in the Boston community for more than half a century. And I now, as a supervising attorney, manage our police misconduct docket. And so what that means on a practical level is that day in and day out, I receive the community intakes or requests for legal representation from across the state for individuals who believe that they have been whose rights have been violated by a police officer or a police department. And so that runs the gamut. As Jamarhl sort of mentioned, the conversation is much larger than just death. We see regularly intakes about racial profiling, about improper stops and seizures, as well as police brutality and then officer-involved violence that results in death. These come in, I must review hundreds of requests for representation a year across the state of Massachusetts. And so that's to give people some scope for what Massachusetts actually does look like. I know that in my introduction, Rahsaan mentioned that I represent the family of Terrence Coleman. And in 2016, when Terrence Coleman was shot and killed after his mother called for medical assistance and begged to not have the police officers arrive, but they did anyway. And of course, within a matter of moments of their arrival, Terrence was shot and killed. That incident, in my opinion, never garnered even a fraction of the attention that it might have had we been in another state. And I fundamentally believe that is because we have not pushed ourselves as a community in Massachusetts, and we have not allowed our leadership, or perhaps not allowed, but our leadership has not been willing to be as outspoken as it needs to be able to make some systemic shifts in how we engage with police departments. And by we, I mean communities of color engage with police departments. And I tell people all the time, in addition to monitoring our police misconduct docket, I also manage our employment discrimination docket. And so uniquely, I represent Black police officers across the state who are frequently engaging in employment practices that have a disparate impact on people of color. And so what I see on both sides of the coin is that if we cannot create systemic change, ways to hold individual officers who engage in misconduct responsible for their actions, then the community is not getting the best department that it deserves, nor are individuals getting the type of service from their public safety agencies that they deserve. When I first started practicing police misconduct, one of my mentors told me, and I believe this now fundamentally to be true, is that where there is smoke, there is fire. And I believe that because more than 50% of the intakes that I review are complaints against a police officer who has had prior misconduct. And that is after you fight a police department to be transparent and provide personnel records short of litigation, which is an uphill battle all on its own. That is after considering that there are police departments that do not have a uniform way in which they handle civilian complaints or internal complaints from IAD and anti-corruption. We saw the lawsuit in Springfield not so long ago, a successful Monell verdict about the failure to have a proper complaint procedure for the Springfield Police Department. They're not alone in that. That is not a uniform incident. That happens across the state of Massachusetts. And so what I know from my experience representing the Coleman family is that post is the first step in a long process that we have to follow to find uniformity, to find some standardized ways to hold individuals accountable. What I hope to see from that is not only much more transparency around prior misconduct, and I fundamentally believe we need some broader definitions for what constitutes misconduct, what should be followed through post. But I hope also that that encourages police departments to consider that we also need some uniformity in our training. The only way you are going to, once the spotlight gets shown on how often misconduct is engaged in by police officers, your next step should be, how do you decrease that? And the only way to decrease that is to give people the fundamental tools that they need to not engage in that misconduct. The two officers that arrived at the Terrence Coleman home in that shooting case, they were both brand new officers. They had been on the job about a year. But you know how they learned that behavior? They learned it from their supervisors. That was passed on from an elder officer to them, and they didn't have the fundamental ability through training to know that their way of de-escalating, their way of engaging a Black man who was living with a disability was wrong. And unfortunately, one of those two officers has now been promoted to a detective. This is why we need post. This is why we need oversight. So I'm really excited to be part of this conversation and look forward to Massachusetts getting it together and moving this process forward.
Thank you so much. And thank you for bringing to light the experience of the Coleman family as well. And Jamarhl, I see you noted in the chat box another egregious case here in Boston of Burrell Ramsey White. Lisa Thurau, I want to turn to you. Given your advocacy that you have done throughout the country, that would include a lot of post states, but I'm sure that you have seen some deficiencies. And so what are some of the deficiencies that you've seen and how does it impact the advocacy that you do?
Thank you for inviting me, Rahsaan, and it's a pleasure to be with my esteemed colleagues. There are many posts in America. They can stand for Police Officers Standards and Training or Peace Officers Standards and Training. And the three cardinal sins I see of them, including some in neighboring states where a recent implosion of a post just occurred, is they are very much a club and they are very able to control membership input and decision-making in a way that maintains policing for police with no accountability to communities. The other thing I see is, especially vis-a-vis our work with young people, because we exist to improve how police treat young people and to reduce disproportionate minority contact. And in a survey of police officers' standards and trainings in 2013, our report called If Not Now, When, we found that academies were required by most posts to give only about 4 hours of training on how to work with kids. And by kids, I mean teenagers. And by teenagers, I mean young people who start going into the juvenile justice system at about age 13 or 14 in large and disproportionately racialized numbers. The other thing we found and described in our report, Where's the State, in 2017, is not a single post in the United States had a single standard guiding law enforcement about how to work with youth. And to be sure, this is a hard age to police, but it's also an age that is very protected by laws and unique concerns about its developmental, this youth's developmental capacity has directed by US Supreme Court decisions, which are just unheard of in most law enforcement agencies, much less posts. I would say that posts are necessary, but not sufficient. And I would have to echo what everyone else has been saying. There's no silver bullet. There's, prohibition is the mother of circumvention. You can't do it in one place, you'll try and do it in another. So we have to have an array of systems and mechanisms. And it's important to take the example of youth that I've just given you to see how posts can completely exclude an entire part of the populace when it's developing its standards and training. The other thing I want to say is that Massachusetts is kind of remarkable to me in that compared to other states, almost no requirements of law enforcement are enforceable. And I simply direct you to the state auditor's report. Suzanne Bump demonstrated that while training is required for in-service training, only about 38% of the state's agencies' officers had actually attended it. And this and so many other aspects of policing oversight exist without any teeth, are not enforceable, and essentially work on an honor system that frankly isn't working. So for all these reasons, I would say, yes, let's get this going, but we cannot rely on it to be the fix for everything. And I would like to point out to other states, like New York State right now, which is reconsidering how officers' records are protected to give the same kind of exposure that teachers and doctors have. And the city of Chicago, which thanks to the Invisible Institute, has been able to track officers' complaints. All that's been great, but I'll tell you what, there are officers in Chicago who have 159 complaints. If you don't tie the information and knowledge with actions and mechanisms to address these egregious levels of misconduct, you're just where you started. And it's sometimes worse because you think you've got a fix when in fact you don't.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I think those are some important deficiencies that you've pointed out. So Professor Goldman, I'd like to return to you and dig in a little more. And if you could give some examples of how post systems have failed in other jurisdictions. And I think I neglected to mention that. I don't know that it's been brought up, but Massachusetts is one of 4 states that does not have a post system. So there are a lot of other states to provide a lot of other examples from. So Professor Goldman, if you could.
I think that's a good point to make. Just because you have a post, as Lisa says, it doesn't mean you've solved everything. The funding of that post, the quality of the executive directors. In 2015, I ad listed a study, and they found that Georgia and Florida had about 40% of all the country's decertifications and of law enforcement, and about 80% of all corrections officers enforcement. I don't believe for a minute that those officers in Georgia or Florida are any better or worse than any other place. They just have aggressive, effective laws. And because you don't have to be just convicted of a crime. It comes back to what I said earlier. But it isn't just the laws as written, it is the enforcement of it and the need to keep first of all, there's very little public awareness of the existence of posts and what they do. That's why I do agree with Rep. Holmes that having citizens on the board can help give that perspective, not just law enforcement folks. I totally agree that post isn't everything, even though that's been my life's work. It's a start, it's necessary. And one problem that we have in our country that other countries don't, we have 18,000 state, local, county departments. If you go to England or any others, it's our feeling that everything has to be federalized, at the lowest possible level. And you definitely have problems with these small departments. There are many state police departments in our country, my state, with one person. What kind of monitoring are you going to get there? What's the quality of the chief? So we do have problems with those numbers, and as I say, other countries kind of laugh at us in terms of that. And in fact, one issue that's come up, I think it's not going to be relevant to this, is it's really not the individual officers. You have to look at the quality of the departments. And in fact, some states are now talking about decertifying departments. That's not on the table today, but it's something to keep in mind, because unless you have effective, folks like Dan Zivkovich at the top, you're going to have definitely have some problems. One other thing I would mention about some pluses that are going on now, that is, some states are not just focusing in the state post law, not just focusing on the post itself, but putting pressure on local departments to do background checks. You think it would be obvious, but some of you may recall the name of Timothy Lohman, who was involved in the shooting of Tamir Rice. He'd worked at a department called Independence, Ohio, and there was no checking by Cleveland of his terrible record there. So some states now, Vermont, one of your neighbors, is now mandating departments to check the background. To the department who they're asked has to respond, and there's good faith immunity for an honest response, because it's just unconscionable to me that Cleveland never made that request. So in terms of what more could be in these post laws, take a look at some states that are doing more than just focusing on what the post is doing and putting some responsibility on the departments themselves. And one other point, Colorado, I know you know all about the non-disclosure agreements that came into sight with respect to the Me Too movement. Colorado has now said, if you have a non-disclosure agreement, the chief and the officer, I'll let you go and I won't give you a bad report. He ends up in another department and that new department never found out about it. They have said you have to waive that non-disclosure agreement in order to get a job at that new department. So there are things more than just decertification that can be done, is being done in some of the better post statutes.
Oh, that's great. Thank you for raising that up, Professor Goldman. Jamarhl, I want to come back to you and specifically ask, how will people from some of the most impacted communities benefit from a post system? And also to this question around notification or awareness, how's the community going to know about it?
So much like what we have here with the co-op, right? For those that don't know, Community Ombudsman Oversight Panel, which is supposed to have some sort of level of oversight over the Boston Police Department. And, by and large, unless you're a police reform nerd like I am, you don't even know that this thing exists. You hear the term co-op, you're thinking like, we're sharing an apartment or we're going to get food together. You don't know, so most people have no idea what it is, what it stands for, or anything. Much like that with post, okay? This is why I really was a fan of the term decertification. It's kind of straightforward, right? You can lose your license. A doctor and you do a botched surgery, you can lose your license. A lawyer and you cheat an old lady out of her will, you lose your license. So how will people know? I would hope that legislatures, Charlie Baker and others, would commit also to a public awareness campaign. This is the thing that should be of PSAs. This is the thing that should be on, while you're on the train and that little advertisement thing there above the thing. That it should be on the side of buses. to Lisa's point about schools and all this, this should be pumped in. Well, we're not in school, you know, COVID and all this, but every school guidance counselor, if your school is lucky enough to have one, every, you know, youth center, every health center, this should be pumped into, right? So that these are, by and large, the places where the people who are going to be most affected by the negative impacts of police, these are the places that they traverse. Okay, health centers, community centers, schools and whatnot. And so people need to know, we need to have a massive public awareness campaign. In the past, groups such as the ACLU, the NAACP, Lawyers Committee as well, have done, you know, Matt Blackstonian, have done massive things, printing out newspapers or little pamphlets to say, get out the vote or know your rights or whatever the issues were. So we need to, I believe, once this is all done, we need to mount a massive public awareness campaign of it. And then to Russell's point as well, anything that happens with police reform in Massachusetts or where I'm at in Boston that does not have community involvement is bogus. It's just not legitimate. Because if we expect the people who have been, you know, listen, there should be a place at the table for nonprofits, and there should be a place at the table for lawyers, and there should be a place at the table for law enforcement. But if there's not a place at the table for Joe Citizen, what are we doing? We, the people, right? Public servants, we're the public to serve and protect. Who? Us. So if there's no place on it for community input and involvement, I'm going to say it's doomed before it gets out the gate, right? And for me, as an advocate here in Boston who has advocated for both the co-op and the civilian review board, it's that same reasoning. I like the co-op. It's a smaller group of some professionals with some law enforcement and legal experience and all that. I like that group. But I also, to supplement and work together in tandem, I would also want to see a true civilian review board made up of the old lady with the blue hair and little 18-year-old Tyrone from down the street. I want it all there. I want the citizenry, the community to be able, the taxpayers, the voters, the residents, to be able to be participatory in this process about what happens with the police department that once again is there to serve and protect them.
Thank you, Jamarhl. Lisa, there's been a larger conversation. Again, I mentioned at the outset, people advocating for abolition of police, defunding police. And so there's this conversation about reducing the footprint of policing or transforming policing more generally. And we've seen how systems can reform. You look at the Department of Youth Services that has been taking a more therapeutic approach. It's far from perfect, but it has had an impact. Could you see the same thing happening through a post system?
You know, I think there's actually, for the point of redirecting some of the funding that goes to policing, a lot of common ground with policing. In my experience, speaking with officers across the country over the last 16 years, I often hear them angry that they have to take care of mental health issues, that they have to take care of the homeless, that they have to be placed in schools. And it seems to me we should capitalize on their frustration with having to deal with the fact that for 40 years now, we have totally killed safety nets in America and shunted the impacts of social, economic, and corporate changes onto law enforcement and given them a law enforcement remedy for what's a socioeconomic problem. I'm not sure why they have to answer every call, and I don't think claiming they do is a good excuse anymore, especially when so many American communities are saying, we don't want you. We want a mental health worker. We want a social worker. The fact that police are being put in schools at the expense of social workers and guidance counselors is another fine example of long-term frustration with the use of a law enforcement response for what is not a law enforcement issue. But I'll say this, while I'm really impressed at how juvenile detention alternatives initiatives and incarceration initiatives have worked in Massachusetts, which has had a very bad record for its relative rate index for treating youth of color, I'm not so sanguine that we can persuade law enforcement to do this. My experiences in Massachusetts have been best characterized as being shut out and told to shut up when we recommend alternatives to how to work with youth, or even suggest training that we can get funding to support law enforcement agencies to do. And so because we believe in a decentralized system of policing in the United States, and every chief is basically running a fiefdom with the support of the mayor and the constituents, I think those changes are going to have to boil from the bottom up to make the case that we want to see some of the funding going to law enforcement redirected. And I think today's Boston Globe description of how the pat and frisk policies of the Boston Police Department, affecting mostly kids under age 17, is a good example of an opportunity to say, we don't want that, and don't use your officers' time to do that, and look at the scholarship on how harmful that kind of negative first contact is before engaging in practices that give you your raison d'etre to over-police. So I'm sorry for going in such detail, but it is complex. And in Massachusetts, as Sophia said, the resistance to reform or considering other points of view is very intense.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And really reined in how this can have an impact that the community might not specifically be demanding in regards to diverting funds or divesting from police and investing in community. So the last two questions, I'm gonna turn to Sophia and then Dan, and then we'll open it up for questions from those who are on the webinar. Sophia, we've seen how race-neutral rules and laws are disproportionately implemented. LCR, as you mentioned, has represented Black police officers who have been disproportionately impacted by race-neutral rules, like the hair test case, for example. Do you have concerns about post, and if so, what measures should be put in place to prevent some of the racial disparities that we've seen with other systems?
Yeah, Rahsaan, absolutely. That's a great question. You know, I feel like in the last few weeks, I've used Professor Davis's quote multiple times, right? But that is not enough for us to be non-racist. We have to be anti-racist. And what that tells me is that we have to be more comfortable not just responding when there is a death or a shooting or an altercation we cannot take our eyes away from, but we have to be open to the fact that we have a structural racism when it comes to our police departments, that we have problems at an employment level, and those systemic problems, they run the gamut. You know, they are everywhere from who we recruit, who we hire, who we discipline, who we promote, and who we terminate. And unfortunately, to give Boston as an example, you know, Boston has failed at every step of the way to keep pace with the rich diversity that this city represents. Our police departments across the board are just not representative of that diversity. And the higher up you go in terms of leadership or to specialized units, the more stark that disparity becomes. And so, you know, LCR has spent so much time challenging these, what you might call neutral employment practices that have a disparate impact. But when we think about post in particular, you know, if post comes about and there is no outside oversight, what I believe we will see is the exact same disparities that we see in our civilian complaints, our IAD, and our anti-corruption procedures, in which officers of color are disproportionately being brought before those internal administrative bodies and disproportionately being disciplined. Across the board, I see more officers of color put on leave for extended periods of time after allegations are brought, while their white counterparts get to ride a desk when they are actually facing criminal charges in court. You know, those disparities are so blatant. And if we don't have any external oversight for post is just going to become another mechanism that does precisely that. And I know from my representation of MAMLIO, that this is not something that the officers want to happen without any check system. You know, they don't want to fall prey and victim to a post system so that the state can slap itself on the back and say, "Hey, we have the system and it's doing a good job, it's working." But unfortunately, it's only working for Black people. So I think it's really critical that as this bill sort of comes to fruition, that we think about some of the components that Jamarhl talked about in terms of external oversight and review. It's not going to be enough for us to pass a really open-ended piece of legislation that we allow for each department to implement in its own way, and maybe the only real oversight is in the structure of the forms and the sort of open-ended instructions. Like we need something that provides some reporting back multiple times a year to external sort of stakeholders, and we also need something in terms of the decision making about when we do decide to remove somebody from an office, to take away their licensure, that is a decision that's made by more than just an internal actor or internal leader.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Those are great points. Final question, Dan Zivkovich. Many people have pointed to police unions as one of the biggest obstacles to policing reform. Wouldn't a post system be constrained by collective bargaining agreements as well? And then follow up to that, what does a post system need so it's not limited by CBAs?
Yeah, I don't think they would be constrained by collective bargaining agreements, but if I may take a couple of quick asides. Lisa's comment about policing and school resource officers and responding to calls, I think underpinning all of this goes back to something Jamarhl was talking about earlier, is there has to be a conversation about what do we, each community, what do you expect from your police? Because that's the foundation for deciding what your department looks like, what it does, what the training is, what kind of people you hire. And even Lisa's comments about those who are reluctant to engage in or frustrated by having to go to calls involving people who are struggling with mental illness. That gets back to the kind of people you hire. If you hire and people come into the profession knowing what they're getting into, that makes a difference. The other thing to add is one of the reasons why I think this has taken so long to come to the forefront is there's so many people that assume the right things are happening. And we've seen over and over again that those assumptions are not true, because by and large, you don't read or hear about all of the issues and all of the abuses of power that are occurring. And the last thing I'll add before answering your question is, last year, the legislature, thank you, Reps Holm and Vieira, very generously passed a bill that allowed for more than adequate funding, very thorough funding of training in the Commonwealth. And so to me, the second piece to the puzzle is requiring some accountability, as Lisa said, that we have these training requirements, and if nobody's complying with them, they're wasted, even if they're state of the art. But back to your point, Rahsaan, is that I think that any collective bargaining unit, their concern is their membership. And yes, I'd be naive if I didn't say sometimes they can be a bit zealous. But most of what they're after is, due process for their members. And once that due process is exhausted, then their options are pretty much exhausted. So in a good, strong post system, even a collective bargaining unit has to admit that some of their members do not belong in the profession, but they are obligated to protect and defend them. And a good, strong post system, it has due process. And I can't remember which the other panelists said it. It has checks and balances. It provides for not only accountability on behalf of the officer and the agency, but also on the side of Post. Post has to comply with due process and checks and balances as well to make sure officers are treated fairly and had a chance to present their side of the case. So, and I think any collective bargaining unit, if they looked deeply into their legal defense fund, would find that they're probably spending 80% of that fund on a handful of officers. And it would be good for them to have a mechanism to be able to tell those officers, we'd like to help you, but unfortunately, Post will not let you have a job. But gets back to what Rep. Vieira said early on, is that you engage them in conversations early. And as I think Sophia was saying, they would have a seat at the table, just like you would have community members who are members of the commission and others who are directly needing to have a voice in, what officers do and what kind of officers are hired, would have a seat at the table. So engaging them early in that conversation would make a difference.
We lost you there. It sounds like you're muted, Dan. We lost your sound, Dan.
Yeah, we lost the sound, but he's not muted. The mute icon is not up there.
Yeah, I don't know if your mic died. Okay, so well, at this point, we're going to go ahead and open it up to questions. I thank you all who have been watching and attending. We're at the hour mark. We're anticipating to go to, or a little past the hour mark, so we're anticipating to go till about 12:30. So we wanted to prioritize some questions from legislators and legislator staffers. So I'm going to, and then we will also receive questions from the community via the Facebook Live event. And just for any of the legislator staffers on the webinar who have raised their hand to ask questions, just know that this event is being recorded. I will now turn it over to my colleague Leah, who will call on the question asker.
All right, it looks like we have a question from Mark Martinez. I'm going to unmute you and let you ask that question to the panelists. If you could specify which panelists you would like to ask to answer your question, that would be great.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep, you're unmuted.
Okay. Hi, my name is Mark Martinez and I work for Senator Jalen. My question, I guess it could be for any of the panelists, though Lisa brought part of this up. So Lisa referenced the auditor's report that came out at the end of last year that's basically said police weren't getting the training they were supposed to be getting and that they needed more money to even for all the police departments in Massachusetts to get the level of training that they would need pre a post system. So that seems to mean that implementing a post system would then mean spending more money on police training. And I think specifically when we talk about in the context of COVID-19 and the impact that that has had on the budget, I guess the question is, what is the answer to community members that are concerned at a time when we're going to be told already that there isn't enough money to fund a lot of the programs that people are going to need to get out of the COVID-19 pandemic intact, whether it's housing, food security, and a bunch of other things. How do we then say that part of the response needs to be more money for more training for police when, just how numbers work and we have to pass a balanced budget that is going to take away from services that are already really, really going to be hurting given the COVID-19 pandemic?
Thank you for that question. And I see Rep. Holmes, you unmuted yourself. And I also want to look to Dan Zivkovich on what those costs are.
So I'll try my best to be brief because I would like to take as many questions as possible. This came up with the conversation with the unions. And so my point on more money is that me as a Black man, I get in my car in Boston and I arrive and I get pulled over. There might be a guy with 800 or 900 hours of training that has de-escalation training, that has implicit bias training and all the other trainings that you would expect here in Boston. Get in my car and I drive out to Lee or Lenox or wherever I may drive with these small departments that Professor Goldman was talking about. And I get to some part-time officer who might have 200 hours of training or 400 hours of training or something and doesn't know anything about de-escalation, doesn't have a very good experience because of the community they work in. And so I think we just push back and say that an officer who, because they all look the same to me, typically some white guy with a badge on with a gun. I believe they all have the same exact training and they should all get to the same training. And if that means that today that's going to cost us more money to make sure that everybody that pulls me over has that training, I think that's just a conversation we just have to have with the community. I don't want to get pulled over again by some part-time cop with a badge who doesn't understand all the ramifications that come with that. I want to be pulled over by a professional And if that means we have to more professionalize our industry to make sure that we can make this happen, then I'm a yes to doing it, even though I'm getting a pushback from my community. Let me just say, I represent the Blackest representative district in this Commonwealth. And to Jamarhl's point, we want great police. That's what my community is demanding. And so I know it's not the answer you wanted about let's have less money, but we need to have a standardized system across this Commonwealth that wherever I get pulled over, I'm treated the same.
Yeah.
Honestly, I think the police training fund that the legislature passed last year provides more than adequate funding. If it's, I realize it's going to be taking a dip because rental vehicles are certainly taking a dip. But there's funding there to not only provide adequate training, but there's funding in that stream to provide the best training in the country across the board to all officers. And so the funding of the training should not be the issue. The other thing about a post is that if you want to look at it in true dollars and cents, it's going to take some money to create a post, probably $5 to $6 million to have it staffed adequately. But if you can prevent, if you want to just talk about dollars and cents, if you can prevent one bad actor from performing some terrible crime against the community, that will pay for this agency by itself.
You look at the DJ Henry case, just one of the unfortunate thing, obviously, with DJ Henry, but just one of their lawsuits that they made public, the Henry family got $6 million. And the other lawsuit that they did not make public, we don't know what they got. And Jamarhl talks about it often. Look at how much money our police departments get sued, and how many checks and how much money we have to write because of all the lawsuits. We want to get these bad apples out. And so just on a money piece, I believe that's where we also save some of the money for our towns and cities and for the Commonwealth.
Jamarhl, may I just jump in and say, we can't ignore that the failure to train is disproportionately affecting some communities at every level, their health, their mental health, their ability to maintain economic connections to work. This is maybe it's too much to hope for a uniform system across Massachusetts, but community by community, this is going to be a priority, and law enforcement needs to listen, I think.
Well, if
I can just say that the Caucus is looking for a unified system across the Commonwealth. We're looking for an officer that pulls us over anywhere to meet the same standards.
If you're in the Army, if you came from Massachusetts or Kansas or whatever, you all went to basic training. And now your basic trainings might have been slightly different based on which, training facility you went to, your various instructors. But at the end of the day, when you come out of there, you have a base level standard that everybody is on. Me as a revolutionary, this is what makes organizations work. And this is actually some of the problems with some of the organizations we're seeing now. There are foundational principles that bind you. So if you get into the new Black Panther Party, you're all on the 10-point program. If you get into the Nation of Islam, you all done went through the general, the Muslim training. Whatever you're into, right? There is a foundational principle that we know we stand on these things. We hold these truths to be self-evident. And unfortunately for policing, there is not that baseline, it seems, that cuts across state to state. So that's why we get these big dips and hills and valleys in training, expertise, experience, and all that. And also, too, let's also not forget some of the attitudes of the incoming officers who don't see themselves as public servants. They see themselves as, this occupying force who's coming into communities that they view as enemies because of their own stuff that they come in with.
Great. So let's keep getting some more of these questions, and we definitely want to get some questions from the press and the community as well. Next question.
It looks like we have a question from Alan. Is that Representative Alan Sylvia? I'm unmuting you to ask your question.
Hi, how are you? I just want to thank the panel, very interesting, and especially Representative Holmes and Representative Vieira. I have to say I'm the vice chair of the Joint Committee on Public Safety, and I have a long history, 22 years plus in law enforcement, city of Fall River. I was struck by the comment that we assume that training is happening. And I believe that most people think that that training is happening, and they also assume that we don't have this problem in the Commonwealth, that racism is not very evident here because we don't see a Ferguson, or we don't see what's happened recently in Minneapolis or Atlanta. So it's very interesting and eye-opening. You know, it was mentioned, I think, by Dan or Jamarhl that this should be seen as an asset to communities and police departments, and it should be. All departments are not equal. The training aspect and the cost, I know, you know, training has been improved over the years. In 1974, when I became an officer, I went to 3 weeks of training, hardly enough for what I had to experience when I was on the job. Today, it's certainly very different, but much more is needed in the areas of de-escalation, anti-bias training, and the fact that the training compliance issue, when we look at in-service, we can't assume that because someone goes to an academy, they're all set for the rest of their professional career. That shouldn't be the case, and it should be on the post. There be mandatory compliance with in-service trainings and not subject to that community. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment. We have an additional question, and then we'll move to some questions from.
Can we just repeat who he was, his name and his position?
That was Representative Alan Silva. I forget the town he's from. Alan Silva.
He's from Fall River, Vice Chair of Public Safety Committee.
Yep.
And I think there's a question that we had received in advance from a legislative staffer, so we can go ahead and read that question.
Put my 2 cents in.
Yes, we had a question ahead of time from a staffer from Senator Collins' office, which is asking about the educational requirements. And would the educational requirement for a post system be higher than a high school diploma? And is that an increase?
I'll ask Professor Goldman to take that.
I'm actually not sure what the plan is with the governor. A couple of states, Minnesota and Wisconsin in the past have required some college, but the majority do not. I wish Dan were here. He would know that better than I.
Oh, he's still here. Dan, can you hop on and say?
Yeah, that is usually not a post action. That's usually a legislative action to require, you know, what kind of educational minimum, although it depends on what kind of authority post is given. But there is a push to have, certainly everybody agrees that an educated officer is a better officer. And, you know, having gotten my degree later in my career, I know the benefit of a college degree because I look at what I learned in my criminal justice administration degree that I did not learn in my academy training or even experientially, that I think has allowed me to get where I am today. But the thing that you can't rely on is education by itself does not make a good officer, but there is a benefit to tying those two together. And in a very advanced system, you would have them interacted because you may know that in South America and even in parts of Europe, to become a police supervisor, to get rank, you actually have to attend a police college. It's about criminal justice degree, sociology, and all of that is rolled in because they see the value of a well-educated police officer, especially in administrative roles. But at a basic level, there is a huge push to raise the entry level, and that isn't necessarily opposed. The one caveat I would throw into that is that if you do require a college degree, you don't have the ability to hire some of those blue-collar workers who were never, if you will, school nerds. I mean, they were not academic, but they're very good at interacting with people and doing the day-to-day work of policing. So a middle of the road would be a high school diploma or GED to get in, and then some sort of college degree or college education to move up through the ranks.
Can I just add something quickly?
Okay, go ahead.
So there's a push by Representative Tucker to maybe go to an associate's degree or a level of work experience. The caucus has had that presentation on more than one occasion. We believe that this conversation should move into civil service because we do, and as you may know, the elected of color had a 10-point plan that we had across the Commonwealth. And part of that plan was around civil service. Our commitment from the Speaker and the Senate President is that it's something that they're willing to do in the little short term, little longer term. We are trying to get posts done and signed before July 31st. And there's some other things that the caucus is asking for, but we might get in the conversation with Representative Tucker around more education. It's just that, quite frankly, I won't speak for the whole caucus, but I just feel we have enough barriers already to get on our police force. And those barriers primarily deal with the fight that we're going to have upcoming about veterans and the veterans preference that's going to happen throughout all of our police departments. And we believe that's a fight all by itself. And we should have this conversation about veterans and diversity and remind ourselves our police department, the state police department, is 95% male and 90% white, and that has to end. And so we're hoping to have that conversation soon.
Great, thank you. So
I just want to mention that we also have, part of this conversation has been an educational incentive program as we move to the post system. So what we'll see in this upcoming week will include educational incentive, which would be above and beyond the regular academy piece to become a certified officer. It'll be above and beyond the 120 hours required over the course of 3 years. So that's 40 hours a year over the course of 3 years to maintain certification. But there'll be an educational incentive program that will work the details out as we move forward.
And that incentive is around decertification and implicit bias, not just go get more certifications and more CE credits anywhere. It is specifically incentivizing folks that if you want to go get more than these 40, they must be in these areas of de-escalation and the like.
Great. So we've got a couple more questions, and we want to make sure we get some comment questions from or comments and feedback from the Facebook Live. So the next two, Leah?
Yeah, so we're going to take a question from B. Barnett from WHDH. And after that, Representative Provo has a question, and then we're going to turn to some questions from the public. So WHDH, I'm allowing you to talk and ask your question. That's B. Barnett. If you still have a question, you can ask it now.
I'm sorry, I didn't unmute myself. This is Byron Barnett. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes, Byron Barnett from Channel 7. I'd like to ask this question of Representative Holmes. I believe you said July 31st. I wanted to know what you see as a timetable for getting a post. And the other question is, could you elaborate a little bit more on this issue of a veterans preference? I don't know if that's a Boston thing or a statewide thing, and why you think that's going to be such a difficult fight and why that's so important.
So quite frankly, we had the meeting with the governor and the Senate President, and we as a caucus would like to actually get it done by July 20th so that we would have the 10-day window in case the governor made some provisions. But we're hoping the governor releases the bill tomorrow. We as a caucus will meet with the chair of the judiciary on Wednesday and begin drafting in the House, and the Senate has a different plan. But when we talked to the Senate President, she's thinking the same timeline. Let's get it done by early mid-July so we can get it signed on his desk by more July 21st or so to have just some of the mechanics overriding vetoes and that nature be done. And then on veterans preference, Byron, I can tell you this is the next fight. So I've been in this fight with these folks on the screen for quite a while around posts, but now there's this epiphany by so many folks that this is the right thing to do. And to Jamarhl's point, I think most of the folks of us who've been in this fight for a while, we're very happy that it's happened. We want to see it get done as soon as possible. Our next fight is civil servants. And so it is not just Boston. For those who don't know, you can just go to Google Massachusetts civil service. You can go see any of the eligible lists, and you can see the biggest challenge around the whole veterans preference is it's not police, just police. If you think about fire, there's an absolute preference in Boston, which means that if you have a disabled veteran, they go to the top of the list and they score 75 and someone scores 100 on the test, that disabled veteran goes to the top of the list. So if you just go to eligible lists under Mass Civil Service, you will see that we have hundreds of firefighters or applicants that would be next in line. And a disabled veteran can be a person who has a 10% hearing loss. And so here it is, we're giving the 40 jobs that we might have at the fire department to disabled veterans for the most rigorous and challenging job you can possibly have to disabled veterans. That shouldn't compute to folks. And so we believe this is going to be a challenge, and we have the unions and the like. And so we're hoping to have that conversation soon in the next 6 months or so.
Okay, thank you. Rep. Provo.
Rep. Provo, you're allowed to.
Thank you very much for this interesting webinar. The question that I have has to do with a particular kind of policing body that exists in Massachusetts, which I don't think is subject to any statutes, and that's these regional consortia. The one that our police department belongs to is NESCAUM, N-E-S-C-A-U-M. It's the Northeast regional. The reason this is important is that a lot of medium-sized departments don't have some of the specialized teams. So if Somerville ever needs a SWAT team, it goes to NESCAUM. And these teams are composed of officers from a bunch of different bodies. What I've been able to gather about them is that they tend to be North suburban folks who have no training or experience dealing with immigrant communities, non-English speaking communities in my city, and that there's no accountability for them. I discovered that you'd have to file a complaint with every department that has an officer on a particular SWAT team. Can you talk about what can be done to rein in these sort of regional super police? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question. The LECs, or the law enforcement consortiums, are a significant problem. So I'm not sure if Professor Goldman or Dan, I think with POST, the purview of this conversation is looking at the actions and conduct of individual officers, and they would still be held accountable under a POST system for their actions within one of the consortiums. But I don't know that the POST fits within the purview of, or LECs, consortiums fit within the purview of this. Professor Goldman or Dan, do you all have a comment?
Well, I'm assuming they're certified officers, so that if that's true, that to that extent they would be covered by POST. But the organization itself, I wouldn't think it would be. Dan may have a different idea.
Yeah, and you're right, Professor. They are certainly officers to start with, but and you're right, Rahsaan, that they are that POST would not be concerned about the operation of what those LECs are doing, but if an officer commits an abuse of power while a member of that LEC, Law Enforcement Council, then yes, then posts could take action because they are sworn officers. But the other thing that a strong post can do is can set standards for the kinds of officers and the kinds of training that the officers within those teams must have in order to participate. So there's still those two levels. It's a post can set minimum standards for training and qualification, and then at the same time can hold individuals accountable for abuses of power.
And I think one thing we could look at also is we do have an agency accreditation process, Massachusetts. And right now it's for the departments. And so Denise, maybe this is an ongoing conversation around using the accreditation commission that we have in the Commonwealth to look at these entities as well.
And I'll just add that there's a bill that was filed by Rep. Liz Miranda and Senator Cream on police use of force. And so again, getting to the actions of these officers within the Lex. So now what I want to do, it's 12:30, 33, and we've gotten a lot of questions from press and or from representatives and press question, but there were a lot of comments on the Facebook Live. And so if the panelists can indulge maybe 10 more minutes, we'll get some of those questions, and then the remainders that we're not able to answer on air, I can take those and maybe email those to you, and we can respond. I'll respond in the Facebook link with some of the questions that get asked, just to make sure that we're getting this community feedback and input, because that's one of the things Rep. Holmes said he wanted to make sure he had. So Leah, there are questions from Facebook.
Rahsaan,
Yeah,
could we just read the questions and maybe just get a sense of what are the 8, 9, 10 questions all at once, and then maybe we can try to figure out how to address them, because I would definitely like everyone to be heard.
Yeah, there's a whole lot more than 8, 9, or 10.
Oh, I see. Okay, I'm sorry.
But maybe we can do like two or three, get those questions, and then the rest I can email them all to you, and folks can answer them, and we can respond in the Facebook.
No problem. I thought it was fewer. I apologize.
That's fine.
So like Rahsaan said, there are a lot of questions that came in on Facebook Live, but we want to get to some of them. There's, I'll read two off right now. There's a question from someone named Lorraine asking, what would be the process to bring the Massachusetts Department of Correction prison guards into alignment with post? And how is that decided upon with police departments nationwide? There's also a question from someone named Lisa wondering how you can ensure that training will be effective if a culture in the police force demands that you adhere to a strict authoritarian hierarchy, and how can we ensure that junior officers could be protected when calling out senior officers potentially?
So that first
So
one,
is it okay if I go?
Yeah.
Okay, so we have been trying to add in duty to intervene into the conversation and use of force. Those are two things that the caucus is pounding on, and have agreement from the House and the Senate leadership that those would be things that after, because you have posts, but then we're trying to, this moment calls for more. So we're trying to make sure we embrace that idea. And then the caucus, Representative China Tyler asked that question around correctional officers today in our conversation with the governor. And to Professor Goldman's points, he said the same thing, that we're going to probably have to set up something different. As Professor Goldman mentioned, other states have something different correctional officers. And I think that may be the next stage. Today, the way the governor has the bill set up, it is all the folks who are in community. So they are everything from our, the folks who are at universities, of course, all the folks who are state and local, state police, things of that nature. But then we may need to do something for correctional officers. And he did begin that conversation today. That's about as quick as I can say it.
Rahsaan, if I could talk to that second piece about the training component, because I think that's critically important, that we recognize that this isn't sort of a one pill prescription, right? That we can take. This is a conversation about a really meaningful step in the right direction, but it's going to require action on multiple fronts. One thing I can speak to in terms of the training is that if it is efficient, or if it is effective, and if the post system is also effective in terms of actually decertifying those that should be, what this will start to create is a culture shift within departments. It will start to create a deterrent effect for individuals who I think at this point feel very free and at ease to engage in misconduct and engage in behavior that we are trying to curb. it may not necessarily rise to the level of immunizing younger officers to speak out, but it will start to change a culture and shift and hopefully conversations within these departments such that officers recognize that this is no longer the norm. You know, the locker room talk is not the gold standard, but rather the training and the consequences that are associated with decertification, if they're taken seriously, are the gold standard. And I think that's sort of critically important to note.
I would like to.
Sorry, do you want to go, Jamarhl?
No, you go first.
Thank you, Jamarhl. I'd like to point out that when we do our training with officers on how to interact with youth, we have very clear measurements on the changes we're looking for, and that is a decline in arrests of youth for specific kinds of arrests. And we know that specific kinds of arrest reflect bias and a kind of predatory policing approach. So we can eliminate those, we're already seeing change. And I'm really thrilled to say that if you have true backing by a law enforcement leader to say, we're pushing out the old way, I want a new way, I am being watched by my community, I am being held accountable in all these different ways, bureaucratically and by community's oversight and response, you do see young people stepping up in the police departments and pushing back and say, no, I got this. You know, you don't want to be over the fold. And we see other young officers needing to be told by other older officers, don't do that. You're going to get yourself over the fold. So I would not assume that all young officers are the same. And I would say that there's reason to be hopeful. And frankly, I didn't think there was, but the speed with which some law enforcement lap up new approaches is really inspiring and gives me hope. Thank you, Jamarhl.
Yes, I just had a community meeting the other day. It was called Talking to the Police. And out of that conversation, what the community and officers seem to be okay for and, you know, thinking like a cop, what do they do for us? They want us to report crimes, but oftentimes we're scared, we're frightened. We can't, you know, do that. So what do? Anonymous tip line. So I'm in the process now of trying to set up an anonymous tip line, something like, you know, 1-800-BAD-APPLES or something, right? Where officers would then be able to, out of the pains and penalties and the fear of, you know, the repercussions at their job, hey, you too can call in and leave an anonymous tip. And if you know that Officer Sullivan or whoever, Officer Smith, is doing drugs or beating this woman or shaking people down or what have you, you can leave an anonymous tip. And that alleviates, hopefully, some of the stuff from them. And because of the narrative that has been on our community for so long, which is, you know, stop snitching, right? But there's only one group of people who don't snitch, right, more than the hood, and that's the police. Rahsaan, you're on mute still.
Bad. There's a question from Crystal Haynes from Boston 25 that we'll ask, and then there's a couple more from the Facebook Live that I'll read, and then I'll bring this to a close. And so thank you all for your indulgence. But from Crystal Haynes from Boston 25, what oversight is in the bill, and what are we doing to deal with union resistance? So I'll look to Rep. Holmes and Rep. Vieira on that question.
So I can tell you union resistance has really showed itself on yesterday, Crystal, and that we did meet, the Black and Latino Caucus met for our second time with the representatives from many of the unions. But quite frankly, I think the things that they were most hesitant about was the fact that they just were not part of the conversation, particularly when we went from a bill that Rep. Vieira and I were proposing to set up a study to go to post, and now we've moved at 100 miles an hour now, we're going to set up posts. And so fundamentally, they agreed with most of the things, duty to intervene, use of force. They agreed there were a couple of small things that they thought they still should have they should have the right to grab anyone in any kind of way, even if that's a chokehold, if they're fighting for their life, things of that nature. They thought some of the words must, if they walk up on a car and someone just straight out starts to shoot them, and we have the word must, they must de-escalate first before anything. They're like, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. That's not the way our job works. That sometimes we walk up and someone's ready for us, and we immediately go into some type of altercation. So those were the types of things that they were concerned about. They were also concerned about most about the word licensing, because essentially posts has been being something we've been talking about for 10 years, and they didn't like the word licensing, and they were going to take their license. And so I can say we moved towards de-certification, and certification being the word and the like. And so my conversation with the governor and his team is simply there are some mandatory things that will get you decertified. To Professor Goldman's points earlier today, they are clear. They're not just conviction. There are things that will get you decertified, period, no discussion. Those will not be something you can go to collective bargaining, go in some back room and figure out what you can do for your contract and all the other stuff with the unions. Those are just going to be gone. You're gone. But then there are some discretionary things to Rahsaan's point about some of these things, and Jamarhl about, hey, they're beating their wife, things of that nature. If that doesn't rise every single day to being decertified, those will still have to go through some type of civil service and give them their rights they normally would have for arbitration and the like. But there are some things that unions and contracts will not matter. And then oversight, I can tell you the caucus is pushing very hard that the committee not just be a reconstruction of the MPTC today. A bunch of a bunch of white guys, overseeing this that are police officers. It is much more, we want it to be as equal community voice as it is police. And the unions were also saying we set up all these things more for administrators, the chiefs and things of that nature. They want to have a voice. And then Rep. Vieira was at that meeting. He may have something else he wanted to add. I apologize because I was long.
Just be quick. Thanks, Russ. I think that the key is that just as everyone here in this panel has been fighting for a seat at the table, that's where the pushback is with the unions. We want a seat at the table as well. And we should all be at the table together. We've been saying this all along. In order for this to work, this community dialogue, but when we get into the actual oversight, the seats have to be at the table for law enforcement and the community. And I think that what we'll see move forward will include that. It will include not only the oversight of the post entity having seats at the table for both non-law enforcement and law enforcement officials, but also the actual entity, the group, the subgroup that will deal with the decertification process will include the community as well as law enforcement. And as long as we keep that commitment to the community and to the law enforcement, to our unions, that we're going to continue working together, we got a bright future.
Wonderful. So there's just two more Facebook Live questions that we have. There are plenty of more, but there's two more that I'm going to read from the chat, and then we'll bring it to a close. But again, for all of the other Facebook Live questions that we received, we'll do my best to call those together and send them to the panelists to get their responses via email, and then we can post them on the Facebook link. So Jennifer asks, is there evidence that states with posts have fewer problems with police? And what about the training the police receive right now? How is posts different from these? And then Pacey asks, I am curious about whether post systems screen officers for PTSD and dark triad personality traits, psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism, which seem likely predictors of future problems. So Professor Goldman and or Dan, if you all want to answer that, and then we can bring this to a close.
Dan there?
Yeah.
On the PTSD and psychologicals, why don't you take that one?
Yeah, every department should be testing for those kinds of things anyway, and you don't just test for mental health psychoses, the MMPI spectrum. You look for traits as well. I mean, a good hiring system includes testing for aggressiveness and appropriate levels of assertiveness and not being too timid. All the character traits come together that make a good officer. So yes, the post can mandate that certain instruments be used, but certainly every post that sets hiring standards does require some sort of a check of the candidate's mental ability to do the job.
Rahsaan, do you want me to take the question on, is there any showing that states with strong decertifications have fewer incidents?
Yes, please.
It's a great question. The press asks that all the time, and I don't know the answer to that, but I'd like to put it in this context. There are 30,000 decertified officers. That's my guess ever since the posts have started nationally. As I mentioned, a couple of states, Georgia and Florida, have the most of those. But as far as can we show that they have any, what the impact has been, notice how we don't ask that question. Can you show that if you have a system that takes away the licenses of bad doctors or lawyers, does there indication that they have, is that a better system than one that doesn't? So I can't answer the question, but intuitively you would just assume if you're taking people out who are committing deadly force, unauthorized and all that, but it's still a great question. And if there are any empirical scientists in Boston, ask them that question. I don't have it.
Great.
If I can layer on top of that,
yes,
Rahsaan, I mean, that gets back to, and a couple people have implied this, is, we have 49 different states that handle this 49 different ways. And a lot of it gets back to, and I think Lisa pointed this out, the culture within a department itself. So as the professor said, certainly there are fewer officers who abuse authority in states who actively decertify. But that doesn't necessarily mean the culture within the department or the culture within the state or culture within policing in that state is where we would want it to be in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So there's a couple of layers to making sure that you get the policing that the community wants.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you again to all of our panelists, to Representative Holmes and Representative Vieira, for all of the work that you all have done getting us to this place. And that there is unfortunately this moment that we're able to capitalize on the work and advocacy that you have done. And then to the rest of our panelists, Professor Goldman, Dan Zivkovich, Jamarhl Crawford, Sophia Hall, and Lisa Thurau, thank you all so much for everything that you've brought to this conversation and all your information. To all those who are watching on the Facebook Live and we didn't get to your questions, I will endeavor to get those questions to the panelists and get some responses and try to post them back in the Facebook link. So thank you all very much for attending. Hope you found this edifying, and we look forward to implementing a very strong post system here in Massachusetts.